I will now present our first author, which is Dave Greyston. I'm sure many of you will know that David is director of the Doherty Centre of Corporate Responsibility at Cranfield University. He's also an award-winning author and the author of Greenleaf Publishing's Social Entrepreneurship and all that jazz. So over to you, David.
Neil, thank you very much, and hello to everyone who is taking part in today's webinar. I think the really positive news today is that we have unprecedented global awareness of the issues around sustainable development. I think the Paris Climate Treaty that was concluded at the end of 2015, the promulgation of the Sustainable Development Goals for the whole world last September have galvanized a great deal of international attention now in a very exciting and very positive way. And I personally am very bullish about the prospects right now for sustainability and sustainable development. I'm seeing leading companies who are taking up those challenges, both from the Paris Climate Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, and thinking about how those developments are going to impact their future business strategy and what kind of changes will be required in their future business strategy. And I think those businesses which are already responding positively to these new realities are particularly those which have already been asking themselves some very searching questions about just what is our purpose. And purpose is something which I'm hearing a lot more from leading businesses that they are really trying to get to grips with, and to give more serious consideration to a purpose beyond the idea that they are there simply to make profits and to maximize shareholder value. Personally, I don't regard maximizing shareholder value as the purpose of business. I think it should be the consequence of a well-run business, but certainly not its purpose. And I'm interested in the way that quite a number of businesses today are using mechanisms, whether it's the board mandates that Tomorrow's Company, Mark Goyder and colleagues have been working on with their ideas of inclusive business, or whether it's the methodology developed by Better Business Blueprint to help businesses and other organizations indeed to think through their purpose, or whether it's Lord Brown, John Brown, the former CEO of BP, in his most recent book, talking about the need for businesses to have a purpose, a societal purpose beyond simply making money and beyond profit. And I think that really is the first important development that I would be highlighting. We did some work in the Doherty Centre back in 2014 with Coca-Cola Enterprises, asking both current CEOs across Western Europe and the next generation of business leaders. So young people who just finished an MBA or another management master's program in a leading European business school. We asked both of those groups about whether they thought that businesses should have a purpose beyond simply making money. Overwhelmingly, both today's CEOs and the next generation of business leaders were agreed that businesses did need that broader societal purpose, what some have called blended value, or what my good friend and colleague Jane Nelson many years ago now described as SAB2, both shareholder added value but also societal added value, or the whole idea of Michael Porter and Mark Kramer around shared value, whatever you want to call it. This idea that businesses should aspire to have, and indeed try and deliver on having, a purpose beyond simply making profits and beyond addressing their own business needs, but also being a net positive impactor on society. What was interesting when we did the work with Coca-Cola Enterprises back in 2014 was the difference in views between current generation of CEOs and the next generation, when we asked the question about whether they thought generally that business today already had a broader societal purpose. Virtually all the current CEOs, 86%, believe that businesses today generally do have already a societal purpose. Only 19% of the next generation of business leaders agreed with that proposition. And we concluded in our white paper for Coca-Cola Enterprises, Combining Profits and Purpose, that actually what the next generation were expecting was a much more integrated and rounded sense of a societal purpose than was clearly the view of many of the current leaders. I think the second very significant development is that faced with many of the global sustainability challenges, whether it's on climate change or whether it's on water or any of the other major SDGs, business leaders who are at the vanguard of progress are recognizing that there's only so much that they can do individually, however big and powerful and successful and committed their individual businesses are. And so in addition to this idea of businesses looking for a broader societal purpose, I think another major theme that I would be highlighting is the crucial importance of businesses collaborating, not just with other businesses, but also often with NGOs, with governments, with international development agencies, and sometimes, dare I say it, even with academia. Jane Nelson and I wrote in an earlier book for Greenleaf, Corporate Responsibility Coalitions, the Past, the Present and the Future of Alliances for Sustainable Capitalism, about the evolution of some of those leading corporate responsibility coalitions, including, of course, business in the community in the UK. And I very much hope that in the future I'll be able to return again to the question of how businesses are collaborating with a further book looking at the whole question of the next generation of these collaborative forms, some of the leading business-to-business collaborations, but also some of the multi-stakeholder initiatives, which are tending to be either industry-specific, industry-specific coalitions and multi-stakeholder initiatives, or they are being an issue-specific coalition. For example, something like the water mandate or sustainable shipping initiative, or the Better Cotton initiative, or the roundtable on sustainable palm oil, and so on. And I think businesses which are engaging in these collaborative ventures are recognizing that there's only so much that they can do individually, and that they do need to have the mindset and the skills also to be able to act in collaboration with others. And I think that does beg the question, even amongst those leading businesses, are they equipping enough of their high potential talent pool with the mindset and the skills to be effective collaborators? Professor Joseph Nye at Harvard University in the Kennedy School of Government has talked about the idea of needing tri-sector athletes. Dominic Barton at McKinsey has taken up this idea of tri-sector athletes, men and women who are comfortable and confident operating across the three different sectors of business, of the public sector, and of civil society. I've never actually been able to take part in a triathlon myself, but friends who are regular triathlon participants tell me that the toughest part of the triathlon is when you're switching from swimming to cycling and from cycling to running, or vice versa. It's those transition points that are really difficult, which is why I think the analogy of tri-sector athlete is such a good one for what we're talking about in terms of business people with the skills to collaborate. So I think we're going to need businesses to do a lot more about developing their people. And I was indeed taking part in an interesting Responsible Business Week workshop with Brunswick and BITC on Tuesday morning on exactly this question about how do organizations better utilize some of their high potential talent development programs, particularly some of those experiential programs, so things like the IBM Citizenship Call or the GSK Pulse program. How do companies use those programs and others more strategically in order to be able to develop the right kind of skills for the future? I would argue that people who are already being social intrapreneurs inside big businesses, so taking the initiative to develop ideas for new products and services, new ways of doing business, new routes to market, which are both beneficial to the business and simultaneously are good for society. So they are achieving that shared value or blended value or SAV2, societal and shareholder added value. The social entrepreneurs who are instinctively coming up with these social entrepreneurial ideas and championing them, men and women that we wrote about in social entrepreneurism and all that jazz for Greenleaf, they are already, if they are being successful, actually exhibiting many of the attributes of being tri-sector athletes. Perhaps I can just conclude with one final observation. If purpose and collaboration and the kind of skills for collaboration, including the kind of the mindset of a social entrepreneur, is going to become increasingly important, not just for the leading businesses, but also for the fast followers and then for many more businesses to adopt. I think the other thing that I'm hearing a lot more questioning about is however successful individual businesses are in terms of incorporating a commitment to responsible business and to sustainability at the heart of what they are about, will that be enough? Will we, in fact, need to have systemic change? Roger Martin and Sally Offord, Roger Martin, former Dean of the Rotman School of Management in Toronto, Sally Offord, the president of the Skoll Foundation, they just produced a book, Getting Beyond Better, where they talk about the importance of system change. When Accenture did the CEO survey for the UN Global Compact last in 2013, they found overwhelmingly that even the CEOs of committed businesses on sustainability were saying they thought that sustainability efforts were plateauing and that without significant government interventions at the hard end of government policy shifts in terms of laws and regulations, taxes and subsidies, without that kind of system change, it was not going to be really possible to get the kind of major step change that we're looking for. And I listened to Michael Porter from Harvard in the Skoll World Forum on Social Entrepreneurism only last week make a similar observation about the growing view that however successful individual businesses are and however successful organizations like Business in the Community are in terms of getting more individual businesses to do better in terms of really embedding responsibility and sustainability, however successful they are, we need also to be thinking more holistically about system change. And maybe during our conversation later on in this webinar, we'll be able to unpick a little bit further what some of those elements of system change might be looking like. Neil, thank you.
Thank you, David. That was very, very interesting, and I can see already that stimulated quite a few questions coming through on our feeds, so thank you. Next up is Deborah Leitsinger, and she's joining us from Massachusetts, so let's hope the line holds. Just again, I think many of you will know Deborah, for those who don't. Deborah is a consultant that advises many companies and governments and union agencies on corporate responsibility issues. She has advised leading multinational companies on strategy and supply chain issues and a number of initiatives such as the UN Global Compact, the Global Reporting Initiative, and the UN Environment Programme, to name just a few. She's also a senior fellow at the Lewis Institute of Babson, and she is the author of Greenleaf Publishing's Corporate Responsibility Codebook. So less from me and over to you, Deborah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Neil. Can you hear me? How is the sound?
It's great, Deborah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, let me say that it's a great pleasure and honor to share a platform with David Greyston and Michael Hopkins, who I've known for several decades both and admire greatly. And I also wanted to thank Greenleaf, my publisher, for the past 15 years, and appreciate this opportunity to share some ideas. So I wanted to share with you some of my thoughts on where I see sustainability and the future of responsible business. And I wanted to start with a question, and that is, what would a sustainable economy look like in 2040? And this was a question that was posed to me a number of years ago. I was part of the Aviva PLC advisory board, and Forum for the Future was working with Aviva on this question. And they asked us that question, and my answer was, we don't have the language to even describe what that would look like. And as soon as I said that, I thought, here I am, I'm an author, I'm a writer, I love language. This is a really interesting mission to begin to think about this new vocabulary. And then to phrase it in another way, how would a just business operate in 2040? And so I began to think about language and frameworks and what kinds of frameworks we might need to think about 2040. And wanted to share with you this interesting thought from Cheryl Heller, who developed a master's degree in design for social innovation and has this wonderful concept that all change begins with language. And I think this is very true in our field of sustainable and responsible business. And so I began to look at a wide range of disciplines to see how those disciplines might help us to think about this emerging language. And to that, I would add others as well. The legal field is also an interesting space to think about this emerging language. And I wanted to share with you some of this lexicon that I've been working on, and there's many directions this could go, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts as well. But some of the interesting frameworks out there, I think one of the most important ones is the concept of B Corp. And a B Corp is a for-profit company that's certified by B Lab and addresses social, environmental performance, and also has commitments to be accountable and transparent. And I think this has been a really interesting movement. It's a great example, I think, of this emerging lexicon. And I think this is really getting some interesting traction. And what I thought I would do is briefly introduce you to two of the B Corps that I have worked with and written about in one of my books. And that first one is Greyston Bakery. And I tell people that I bet that most of you have had some contact with Greyston Bakery. If you've ever had Ben & Jerry's ice cream with brownies in it, you have had a connection to Greyston. Greyston makes the brownies for Ben & Jerry's ice cream. And Greyston has a fascinating story. It was founded by Bernie Glassman. Bernie Glassman started off as a rocket scientist at NASA, decided to change careers and become a Buddhist leader, was a very successful Buddhist leader, and then made another pivot and said, I want to address the epidemic of homelessness in Southwest Yonkers, which is a community right outside of Manhattan, and founded Greyston Bakery with the plan to hire people who were formerly homeless, who perhaps had never had a job. And it came from some really interesting experiences that he had had. He spent a lot of time in soup kitchens and homeless shelters, and he realized that many of the people that were homeless had children, they had families, and it was very hard for them to find work because they had children. And then it was very difficult for them to find a home because they didn't have a job. And many of them perhaps were from generational poverty who had never had a job, didn't know how to weren't part of the economy, didn't have a bank account, didn't have access to education. And so he founded Greyston to create jobs for people. And he did something really pioneering. He developed holistic systems so that people could access childcare, affordable housing, access to health care, open a bank account. And this provided the structure, and I would say the systemic change to allow for a real breakthrough in Southwest Yonkers. And his objective was to end poverty in Southwest Yonkers. And I wanted to introduce you to some of the vocabulary that Bernie developed that I think is really exciting and transformative and has some interesting ideas for us as we think about what is responsible business. And so he developed this concept of open hiring. And open hiring is this idea that we need to hire people who are marginalized and give them opportunities to become part of the economy. And so many of the people who come into Greyston come through open hiring, and they put their names on a list, and they are hired. Some of them are refugees, some of them are fully incarcerated, and would probably not be able to get a job elsewhere. And the other part of open hiring is that of path making. So this is an idea that we're on a path, and Greyston helps the individuals that it brings through the program to find their own path, and that might be getting a high school equivalent degree, or it might be becoming an apprentice in another store or in the area. This idea, I think, path making is very exciting language that let's think about the future of responsible business. And then the other company I wanted to mention, another B corporation, is Preserve. And Preserve makes toothbrushes and Tupperware and all kinds of kitchen and other kinds of plastics. And it is completely sourced from recycled plastics, and then again they recycle the products that they make. And some of the interesting language that they use, and I wanted to share with you this concept, is they don't talk about their consumers, they talk about their preservers. And I think this is a great way of thinking in a different way, that we are not simply consuming things, we are preserving them. And to David's excellent point about how business needs to collaborate, Preserve is a fantastic example of that, and they work with Stonyfield Yogurt, they work with a number of companies to source and recycle plastics and then turn them into other kinds of products. And there's a range of other companies we can talk about. I think one of the interesting trends is we have larger companies becoming certified B Corps. Last Earth Day, I was in Brazil, and I met with Natura. They've become the world's largest B Corp. Eileen Fisher this year became a B Corp. So we're seeing some interesting developments of this going from being smaller companies to larger companies learning about this new model. And I wanted to also mention that my thinking around language also comes from the work I've done on the Corporate Responsibility Codebook, and this is the third edition that we launched in New Delhi last year. But I think this is one of the fabulous contributions of codes and standards, is the creation of definitions and the creation and consensus around responsible business. So I think this has been a key contribution to the work that I'm doing. And just briefly around the lexicon, I am developing a new curriculum for teaching sustainability and social innovation, and this is some of the language and concepts that we're writing about. I just wanted to point out the term zero knot, which I think is fantastic expression that John Elkington contributed to the lexicon of a social entrepreneur or intrapreneur who's trying to create, take a social ill to zero, like Bernie Glassman working to create an end to poverty in Southwest Yonkers, and they haven't gotten there yet, but they have certainly made a huge contribution. And so we're working with a lot of people all over the world to define language, and I work with my students, and this is part of what my students do is develop concepts and either sometimes coin their own words or share words from other languages, but to really think about what is the mindset that we need to have for sustainability, for social innovation. And one of the things I wanted to do was to extend two invitations. One is for any of you who are interested to come and visit us at Greyston. I've been asked to develop an immersion program to help bring MBA students and executives to Greyston to learn about social enterprise in an immersion program. And what could be more fun than doing that in a brownie factory? And part of what we're doing in that curriculum is creating this new lexicon for the future. And my second invitation is to have you share with me some of the words that activate you and your organizations to innovate and be more responsible and sustainable going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah. Again, that was very, very interesting, and also we stimulated quite a lot of questions coming through the feed. So thank you. Next is Michael Hopkins, and just to underline the global nature of this webinar, Michael joins us from Nairobi. Michael is CEO and Chairman of MHC International, Research and Service Social Enterprise Arm of CSR. Holds a doctorate in labour economics from University of Geneva, and was formerly the senior economist at the ILO. He is also a keen supporter of AFC Bournemouth. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Michael.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you for the plug for my team. Thanks to Luke for organising this, and nice to hear both David and Deborah. I'm going to try and keep my remarks to about 10 minutes. It's already very wide-ranging, and I take notes that Deborah has brought a whole set of new words into the conversation. For my part, I'm just going to do a more traditional presentation and talk a little bit about what I wrote about was that the idea that CSR and sustainability are going from the margins to the mainstream. Of course, it depends where you sit very much. Certainly if one sits in the UK, where a lot of these issues have been very, very lively for some time. But as one moves away in concentric circles, away from London, Manchester, and so on, moving out, I think the confusion gets bigger as we move away. I dread to say that it's a centre, because there are centres all over the place and people doing all sorts of good work from Beijing to Buenos Aires. But what I see and I worry about a little bit is terminology, and it's always, I think, helpful to see new words and new ideas coming through. One should never be against that. And you can see that I stuck with the phrase corporate social responsibility for now 25 years. And I added sustainability to my lexicon, shall we say. You might say I'm a bit slow getting there, perhaps, but part of it is that I'm rather worried about some of the terminology we use. When I talk to companies and organizations, sustainability immediately means environmental issues and environmental aspects, and quite often we tend to miss what I call the systems approach to looking at these issues. So what I'm going to do unashamedly is talk over some slides, and I know it's very difficult to both look and listen at the same time. Most of my slides are pictures, including the one here, which is in front of my house, which is just outside Geneva in the French Alps. So why CSR to begin with? And well, in the book that Greenleaf kindly allowed me to publish, it covers the teaching that I've done over the last 10 or 15 years. And it unashamedly looks at CSR and actually equates it to sustainability, and I call Sustainability 1, which is the old look of it, which was behind the foundations of the Global Reporting Initiative, for example, from Ceres and so on, to what I now call Sustainability 2, and many other people do as well, where Sustainability 2 is very similar to what I mean by corporate social responsibility. But then people say, well, isn't this simply greenwashing PR? I think perhaps we're certainly where you people are sitting right now, except those outside of Europe. And I see that Rosemary, my collaborator here in Kenya, Rosemary Wahami, is part of the conversation today, is that there's certainly been a flood of interest in this whole area, and it's certainly no longer in the margins, but certainly coming into the mainstream. A lot of my work is explaining what all this means around the world. And, this slide, I'm not going to go into any particular detail, but it's actually a barbed wire manufacturer in the outskirts of Nairobi, where one finds that people are doing a lot of the issues that we talk about without even thinking about or ever having been to academia to find out what they've been doing. So I'm pretty proud to see that this company is going ahead and the people working about it. And I hope you'll have time to get hold of these slides and go back to them. The rationale behind the work that we've all been doing, and I suppose is a pretty significant one, because we certainly don't wish in the UK to see our pubs being washed away as the oceans rise. Nor do we want to, as I know David and myself are very keen on surfing the Pacific, and we've quite often seen this sort of thing. We don't want to see that either. But then we move away from environmental issues. Lehman Brothers did many years ago a social report, but it mainly consisted of their charitable giving. And when I said to them, have you actually looked at other stakeholders, for example, your rating agencies? And they said, no, you focus on environmental and philanthropic issues, and we'll continue to worry about governance and link to banking regulations and so on. I think if they'd actually opened their books up to socially responsible thinking at that time, they might still exist today. Fukushima, another example of a lack of a multi-stakeholder approach. Remember this nuclear explosion at a nuclear power station in Japan, 2011. They've written all sorts of social reports, but lack of system thinking led them to ignore one pretty important aspect of it, which is the word tsunami. So we talk a lot about the future catastrophe, and nothing wrong with that. But I think we need to also think a lot about the present catastrophe and what's happening to social responsibility around the world, and especially our governments. So more and more I see, instead of corporate social responsibility, corporate referring to any collection of bodies, and in particular, it could be public institutions, it could be NGOs and so on. And David Greyston mentioned that in his own introductory remarks. I still think we've got a lot to do about the present catastrophe. And I work in Africa. I'm supporting my wife who's working in Somalia, and she puts up with these sorts of issues on a daily basis. And it's a maelstrom of interest and problems in the social responsibility, and the whole of human frailty can be seen in the sorts of things that lead to these catastrophes, particularly corruption. Another one we all know, I won't go further into that one. So let me just briefly say what is CSR and what is socially responsible business. David Greyston mentioned that, is that we've got now away from creating shareholder value as a key topic that we're looking at, but to look much more at the stakeholder theory of the firm. I'm sure Deborah would agree with us after listening to that fellow Donald Trump in the United States, is that I don't even think he's got to the left-hand side of that particular graphic. To try and bring together a simple model where we could move to in the future, and I've seen B Corp and so on. One thing that concerns me is that sometimes the standards and issues are just too much. And the Global Reporting Initiative, for example, with its thousands and thousands of indicators and so on, I think in the end it tends to be confusing to somebody. This model is one that I'm now working on and applying, have been actually for 10 to 15 years. I unashamedly call it after me, after somebody suggested I do that. The definition I use, I'm not going to go through this for obvious reason, that you can look at this, but just want to say that corporate social responsibility looks at the key stakeholders. It socially includes economic and financial. And the key is how profits are made, not the pursuit of profits at any cost. I think that's pretty well accepted in some parts of the world, especially in the UK, where we're talking to a lot today. Now, CSR to me is a process to achieve sustainable development. And corporate means anybody, private, public, or NGOs. And David mentioned that too. Outside of Europe, CSR, including in the United States, is still equated to philanthropy. So a lot of my work is to say, well, should one stop philanthropy? Or should one look at it in a new way and start thinking about how we can make philanthropy sustainable? My shortened response to people ask me about CSR is that essentially CSR is treating key stakeholders responsibly. Now we can break down each of those words, and that leads to a whole model. And that's why it's a pretty good model, and it's stood the test of time. I'm not going to go into more detail on that. Let me just finish with the sort of things that we can do in the future. Any corporate has a set of stakeholders, and I think it's incredibly useful to identify who the stakeholders are and how they interact together. And you can apply this model to any form of institution. I've applied this to the British royal family. I've also applied it to FIFA. I've applied it to the World Cup, and so on. And it comes up with very, very interesting conclusions. An example here for a company, but I won't go into that in great detail. I see I'm nearing the end of my 10 minutes. One thing I want to insist is more regulation, no thanks. We have to be very, very careful with that. The law on business these days in the US called Dodd-Frank is a subject of huge discussion in the US right now. This particular sign, by the way, is in the United States, and actually is a sign just outside the World Bank. So it's a bit difficult to know whether I can park there and go and chat to people in the World Bank or not. From the margin to the mainstream, ethical corporations just come out with a very interesting short report, which I'm sure will be made available to listeners here, that CSR is becoming an increasingly important part of business strategy right across the world, as you can see from that quick graphic. Can CSR be applied to non-profits? Yes, and in fact many NGOs have been criticized of holding up private companies to high standards, but not to themselves, and including governments. Yes, governments and public institutions, including state-owned corporations, have rarely been examined as to their CSR. Again, my CSR is treating key stakeholders responsibly as I come to the end. And Neil, I know, has been very happy that I'm coming to the end of that intervention. A little bit of bragging, and then this is a bigger brag. Neil said, well, what stadium was that in? And I said, well, you need a big stadium to hold the people who come to our workshops these days. And I'm certain if David and Deborah join me, we need a stadium many hundred times bigger than that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yes, in my defence, I did suspect it was in Lisbon, but I was just testing Michael's memory there. But thank you for all our talks today and experts. We'll now just pick up with a few questions that have come through as the webinar has proceeded. I hope everyone can hear me. Can all the authors hear me? Thank you. Yeah, that's excellent. Thanks very much. Okay, so picking up on the themes of one or two of the questions that have come through, and kind of paraphrasing it, and I'll start with David first, is what's the different cultural approaches that one would expect towards CSR and sustainability? Are they different in one part of the world, or is the approach the same? How do you see that, David?
So businesses all over the world are at different stages of maturity in terms of what responsibilities they think they should take for their social and their environmental and their economic impacts, and whether they are at the stage of really being a denier that they should take any wider responsibilities, or they're at the stage simply of being a complier with whatever local laws or local cultures and traditions expect, through to being a bit more proactive, where some businesses are being a risk mitigator, so more proactively trying to identify what are their negative social and environmental and economic impacts, and trying to manage down their most negative impacts. So that's I always tell my students at Cranfield and elsewhere, I think it gets really interesting. Evolve from a risk mitigator to an opportunity maximizer. In other words, in addition to trying to minimize the negative social and environmental and economic impacts, they start to look for positive impacts and really start to try and build those up, whether that's Vodafone with M-Pesa in West Africa, or whether it is businesses close to home developing more sustainable products and services. And theoretically, all of the different academic and practitioner models of stages of maturity that I've come across all postulate a kind of even a higher stage of maturity, which is a kind of a champion stage, where businesses are very actively sharing their knowledge and their expertise with their value chain, both up and down, but also very often being prepared to open up some of their innovation and their technologies even to competitors in order to achieve sustainable development faster. Clearly, in some parts of the world, I think there is still a much more limited view of what we're talking about. And I guess maybe to get a little bit of debate and discussion going amongst the panel, I'm trying to avoid the language of CSR because I think that very often people do understand it as a kind of a bolt-on to business operations rather than being built into purpose and strategy. Now, I think Michael is very clearly of the latter view, so has a much more rounded and holistic view of what we're talking about. But I think, unfortunately, not everyone around the world who's using the term CSR, whether they're a journalist or a government minister or even a business person, does have that kind of more holistic view. So I am talking more about the language of being a responsible business, and that the most active responsible businesses are those which are aspiring at least to endure into the indefinite future. In other words, to aspire to be sustainable in every sense of the word. I totally agree with Michael that still some people think of sustainability as simply the environmental aspects, and we do need to keep hammering home the fact that Brundtland Commission onwards, from the late 1980s, sustainable development has been seen as having the three pillars: the social and the economic, as well as the environmental. But I think that Deborah's absolutely right that language is important, and the fact that we don't yet have as robust and a coherent and a consistent language as we might isn't very helpful. I do think clearly around the world you've still got some businesses who are still really seeing this as being about philanthropy. I think clearly the very best businesses have long since moved on from that.
Thank you. And Deborah, how do you feel about some of the comments David just said?
Well, I think I agree very much with both David and with Michael in a sense, because I think we're all talking about the same kind of work. And so when I talk about language, I'm less concerned with whether we're talking about sustainability or responsibility, or I love how business in the community uses fair, I think is a great word. But I think where I'm most interested is less about the jargon and more about where is the innovation, where are the sources of new types of models and frameworks that lead us to change. And so I think I'm much more gearing towards how do we innovate, how do we change, how do we create businesses that solve problems, social problems. And I'm very committed to responsibility. I wouldn't have spent 15 years working on codes and standards if I didn't, but I think that is really just the beginning. The codes, the standards, and the working towards responsible businesses is just a beginning. And the future is much more about innovation and new roles for business in being agents of change for social value.
Michael?
Yeah, I know the question you're going to ask.
What's your opinion on that?
I'm going to ask it.
Do you think the CSR language is a bolt-on, or is often being treated as a bolt-on? Something?
I think it's probably all of the above, and I think all of you have kind of moved on. I think let me get a bit boring and go back to I think there's a conceptual model behind most social processes, and I think up to now that CSR, as we define it, has come closest to defining what that movement is all about. Now, 25 years ago, when I discovered CSR after walking away from the UN, where we were discussing the big issues of human development, employment, and so on, I felt frustrated that they weren't getting anywhere, and that's why I wanted to look at the corporate sector. I must say that when I came across CSR for the first time, I thought it was trivial and I would spend 3 months on it and then get on to doing something useful with my life. But what's amazing is that as you get into the issue, and that's why I always start off my talks these days with a definition, and I move on from there so that we know what we're talking about. I'm glad but unhappy that Deborah is working on new lexicons and new language and so on. Certainly we do need a better expression than CSR, and probably we don't have one yet, and sustainability is going to be around for a little bit. But it does worry me about going along with too many definitions and too many different concepts. Let's start with one, agree on that, and then see how we can move that forward, which is a lot of my work I've been trying to do. And I think it's been reasonably successful because one does see institutions such as ISO, even B Corp, and the EU using very, very similar terminology. So I think we've succeeded. Not with GRI, actually, but if you ever look at their stuff, you won't find a definition of what they're doing anyway, which is why they have so many thousands of indicators. Going back to my youth when I was a mathematician.
Thank you, Michael.
Yes, thank you, McNeil.
Hey, was that me, Mark? A question that's... great. Right, so Radhika has sent a question, which we all agree was quite an interesting one. And I think I'm going to go to you first again, David. She asked, with the SDGs agenda set in place, in your opinion, what will define the nature of partnerships, especially for businesses, in order to engage them in SDGs implementation?
So I think a great question.
David?
Yes, I think it's a great question, and it's important to remember that businesses are businesses, and they are not either charities or NGOs or governments in disguise. And that is obviously a sort of statement of the blooming obvious, but it perhaps is important to remind ourselves that when we're talking about how can businesses contribute to the SDGs, it is principally going to be through core business operations and through changing the products and services they produce, developing new business models, getting new ways to reach new and underserved markets. That's the principal contribution of business. It's not some kind of marginal philanthropic dollars. That being the case, the kind of partnerships that we should be looking for are going to be partnerships that will help businesses to develop their commercial operations, but in ways that will also advance different aspects of the SDGs. And I think it's rather exciting. I was with one of the Fortune 500 companies just earlier this morning, and we were talking about the fact that they've done a fairly detailed analysis, and they've concluded that through their mainstream business operations, they believe they are contributing to at least 12 of the substantive 16. I know there are 17 overall SDGs, but the 17th one is about partnerships. So they were looking at the first 16, and they think that they're already contributing and will do a lot more through their mainstream business operations to contribute to those SDGs. So I think the kind of partnerships that we'll be looking for will be where, for example, a social enterprise or an NGO can add their expertise in a way which clearly needs to relate back to their mission and purpose, but in ways that will enable them and the business to be able to deliver on the SDGs as far as the business is concerned, in ways that will also add value to the business.
Thank you. Deborah?
I'm so pleased that we have this question. Thank you, Radhika, because when I first had the invitation from Greenleaf, I thought, I want to talk about the SDGs, so I'm glad we have this opportunity. I do think that the development goals are one of the most important breakthroughs that we have in this field at this time. And I remember that I have on my bookshelf one of Michael's earlier books about sustainable development and corporations. So I think this is a really important breakthrough that the UN has brought business to the table around sustainable development. So I think in my mind, the SDGs are a kind of lingua franca, are a framework to help companies articulate, define, and strategize where they are and where they should be. And I think that I agree completely with David that it is around the creation of new products and services, new relationships with supply chains that will allow the kinds of social innovations that can bring the SDGs to life. And I've been working with a number of companies around how they frame these issues, and one of the interesting new vocabulary items that I've had is from the U.S. retailer Target, who's using the term social premium. What is the social premium that we bring to communities? And I think it's a great question, and I think it's important that companies and organizations come up with their own ways of thinking about these issues, and the SDGs are broad enough that allow companies to develop their own brand of sustainability, of innovation. Great question. Thank you.
Just touching on that as well, Deborah, just before I go on to Michael, is Stephen G. asked, I think he may have touched on this already, but how have the SDGs generally been received by business in the USA?
I think it's a good question. I think that, unfortunately, the UN is not as engaged with U.S. companies as I wish they were. And I think that's the fault of companies here. And I do think that a lot of companies still think really of themselves as U.S. companies and not really as multinationals in a broad way. But I think the UN has done a lot to engage with companies, and private sector has been at the table in these negotiations. And I think that there a huge amount of work that the UN has done around gender and around children is very compelling, and a lot of very good work in that space. But I think we have a huge amount of work to do to bring the SDGs into the vocabulary of companies. But I'm very excited because the students at Babson just had a summit on the SDGs, and so David Greyston was talking about this new generation of MBAs, and so it's fantastic to see the engagement of MBA students in the SDGs. But I think we have a huge amount of work to do to promote the SDGs as relevant to some businesses who aren't used to engaging with the United Nations.
Indeed. And Michael, finally, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. And thank you, Deborah, for mentioning that book that I wrote on development all those years ago. To be honest, when I first wrote it and thought about what could be the impact of business and corporations on the big social, especially development issues of the day, I thought I was a little bit mad. But I went ahead anyway. Neil, please, I know you think I am anyway, but...
no comment.
Not just the football team I support. Soccer, for Deborah, sorry about that. But as I moved forward, I was absolutely amazed to see how many companies and what they were doing. And I worked with the US Chamber of Commerce for some time, and I saw there how companies are starting to work together to address some of the big issues of the day in their corporate citizenship department. And you might want to look at some of their work. I'd just like to finish, and Neil would be pleased again at this, that I did write a few papers on SDGs and business because I started to get interested in them. The MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, which the SDGs replaced, were somewhat forgotten, to be quite honest. They were very target-orientated, but mainly for government and UN agencies and so on. With the SDGs, what the UN did, it actually got lots of companies together. And so the SDGs were partly shaped by the private sector. How much and what impact we're actually investigating right now. And Deborah, maybe you'd like to meet up with my colleague at Columbia University, Professor John Lawrence, former UN, who is tasked at the moment to look exactly what the process was to come to the SDGs. John himself has always kind of ignored corporations in the private sector and always thought the stuff that I was doing on CSR was really out on a limb. He's now right in the center of that, and I'm looking forward to the fruits of his research. But it does seem, and especially, and David mentioned that SDG 17 about partnerships does promote a way forward. So I'm quite happy and excited about that, even given my continuing reservations on the UN, but don't let me get into that. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Okay, and our final question is, in answers less than a minute, is in our area, in the CSR sustainability area, is future bright? I'll start with Deborah.
I think it's a great question. I was born in Brazil, and Brazilians tend to be optimists, and I am definitely an optimist. But I think it depends on us. I think we need to really develop a new way of thinking and acting that we don't yet have, and that is about transformation. And so I think it's up to us. And one of I like to use the example in my teaching. One of the terms in the lexicon is ecocide, and ecocide is the death of the planet. And I think when you start to think about what that means, you see the power of vocabulary to make you think about things in different ways. Another example is climate justice. So I think we need to expand the way we think and the way we act and the way we engage and the way we hire to really create new role models for business and society. So it's up to us. That's the good news and the bad news.
David, are you as optimistic as Deborah is in many ways?
So I'm absolutely with Deborah. It is entirely up to us whether we make that future bright or not. And I think that that's going to require social entrepreneurs inside large businesses. It's going to require social entrepreneurs. It's going to require responsible businesses and responsible business leaders. It's going to require entrepreneurial NGOs, and it's also going to require much more future-orientated, much more long-term focused public officials. The Oxford Martin School published a report a few months ago called Now for the Long Term, big report chaired by Pascal Lamy and other international public servants, and they start with a very arresting sentence. Now is the best time in human history to be alive. Now is the best time in human history to be alive. Generally, I think that is right, but I think it is very much up to us whether we are going to fulfill that potential or not.
Okay, and Michael?
Thank you, Neil. I like the first thing that David Greyston said when he started today that about the whole field of responsible business and society and so on, he's very bullish. And I think probably all three of us are that way. I think there's lots of things, so many things that are going on. It's changed even in my lifetime. I always think any time was a good time to be alive. Of course, it depends where you are. And I think we're very lucky to be able to be reflecting on these issues and be part of this huge movement. And I hope the listeners too will also see where they are and what they're going to do about some of the big issues that we've been talking about. And going back to the previous question, it is kind of amazing to me that big business, well, we know NGOs, we know public sector, has been looking at the big issues, but to see businesses now looking at the big issues in ways that we've never seen before, and all the adjectives that both Deborah and David have so brilliantly brought forward, I think that those are all being used, and I think it's a kaleidoscope of forward movement, which I find very, very exciting, even as I see around me and around the world a lot of depressing things that are going on. But I think with people such as those listening, those around the table, we've all got a lot of work to do, but let's all keep our eye on the ball and let's try and move society forward for the better. So thank you very much for allowing me to participate today, and nice listening to my colleagues too.
That's great, and thank you, Michael, Deborah and David, for some interesting and stimulating points, and thank you very much. Thank you, and just before we sign off, I would just like to say thank you also to the attendees for today's webinar. I've been reminded to point out that the BITC will be running a Business Unusual conference on the 12th of May. That takes place in Leeds.